Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this legislative press conference. I'm Bailey Carlson, Director of Constituent Services in the Governor's Office. Just a reminder to those on the phones that you can mute your lines by pressing *6 and unmute during the Q&A by pressing the # and 6. Also, for those in the room, please turn on the mics at the tables when you have a question and make sure to speak into the mic. We've had a few constituents call in and say that they're having a hard time hearing the reporters ask the questions. Now I'll turn it over to Governor Dennis Daugaard.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this conference. I have a couple things I wanted to offer at the outset, and then I'll open up for any questions you may have. The first thing, on Wednesday of this week, just 2 days ago, the Volcker Alliance issued its budget report cards for all 50 states. And I was pleased to see there are only 3 states in the nation that got all A's and B's, and South Dakota was among them. And there were only 2 states that got 2 A's and 3 B's, and South Dakota was one of those 2 states. So I have here an excerpt from that report that describes South Dakota's budget report card. There is one, what I would consider an error in it. It said South Dakota was one of only 7 states to post A's on legacy cost practices in all 3 years. This is a slightly lower hurdle for South Dakota than for other states, as it has no liabilities for post-retirement health benefits and thus no need to fund them in advance. That is not exactly correct, because when I came into office, we did have some post-employment benefits liabilities, which we eliminated. And so, of course, if you only look back 3 years, you'll see 0 in those 3 years, because we eliminated those by paying them off. So anyway, I've got a stack of those report card excerpts, and anyone on the phone that wants to call into our office, we can send you a link. The Volcker Alliance, named after Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve, a few years back. So that's one thing I think I celebrate. The other thing of note, I think we've had a pretty good bill count this year. In fact, one of the highest I've seen in many years. I think it's the highest I've seen as governor. I might be wrong about that, but I believe it is. I noticed the flood of bills beginning last Thursday. I think it was the unlimited introduction day deadline, and we had, I think, 80 bills come in that day alone. And then we've had considerably more, a considerable number since then. So I just compared to last year, when you add the bills and the joint resolutions, not including commemorations or concurrent resolutions, which are expressions of approval or opinion. When you look at the bills and the joint resolutions, last year they totaled 394. This year, 553, so fully 150 more matters of substance than were in play last year. So, that being said, I am open to any question on any topic whatsoever.
Governor, there have been about 20 measures introduced that deal with the initiated measure and referendum process. Can you provide any guidance to lawmakers as to what restrictions you would be open to and which you might not be open to at this time?
Well, I can talk about my philosophy in this area. I think we want to give deference to the voters and be sure to protect the voters' right to initiate measures and refer measures. I think that any efforts to restrict that in any significant way will not succeed. Either they will be rejected by the legislature or rejected by the voters themselves. That being said, I also think voters and legislators are equally conscious of the recent efforts by outsiders to experiment with their philosophies by initiating a measure to be placed on the ballot and either be a constitutional amendment, as was it the case in Marcy's law, where it was an out-of-stater who wanted to impose his will on our state and had a number of unintended consequences and costs. Or you'll have out-of-staters initiate laws. In the case of initiated laws, the legislature can deal with problems that were not foreseen in the drafting or overlooked by correcting them. In the case of constitutional amendments, you have to wait 2 years to deal with those problems, and so the consequences are going to be felt during that time. And so I think the voters and legislators both believe, as I do, that we should be more careful when it comes to constitutional amendments because they affect so much more and are so much more difficult to change. So those are my philosophies that'll probably guide my attitudes about these measures. Just as a reminder, I have no vote in a joint resolution. Those measures will bypass the governor's office, and if they find support by a majority of both houses, they go straight to the voters.
Governor, Senate Bill 112, as introduced by Senator Russell, I understand, seeks to change the way that the Attorney General seeks permission to conduct certain investigations. I understand he sent you a letter. First of all, two-part question. Have you read the letter and thoughts on it? And then secondly, can you give me an idea how often this law is used, maybe some of the last instances in which the Attorney General asked for permission to conduct a certain investigation?
Well, first of all, in response to the last aspect of your question, I don't recall any time that the Attorney General has asked my permission to initiate an investigation. I've asked him to investigate agencies of my government on occasion, but he has never asked my permission to investigate. I presume he'd just get a warrant if he wanted to investigate something, and he wouldn't need my permission to get a warrant and initiate an investigation. So that law does nothing that I can see. And I would encourage any legislator that wants to communicate with me to walk down and communicate, because we work in the same building, and I don't see any reason why they need to write a letter to me. I don't write letters to the legislature when I want to talk to them. I just go talk to them.
Hey, Governor?
Yes, on the phone.
Governor Daugaard? Yeah, this is Bart Van Cook from South Dakota News Watch. I was wondering if you've taken a position on House Bills 1229 and 1230. Those are the seatbelt and driving while texting bills that would make those a primary offense or a reason to give police a reason to stop someone, and also heightened penalties. I'm wondering if you have a position on those measures.
Well, my attitude on those measures is born of my experience. I've seen those measures like that attempted in the legislature before, and I've never seen majority support in both houses for them. But if they do find majority support, and I'm skeptical that that will occur, I think South Dakotans have the attitude that I should be free to decide whether I buckle my seatbelt or take that risk, or I should be free to decide things like that. Right or wrong, that's an attitude some have. But if those bills do reach my desk, I'd certainly consider them.
Do you think the penalty that's proposed is too harsh, making it a misdemeanor? That would include jail time?
You know, I haven't paid attention to that aspect. In fact, I haven't read those bills. I've just heard they're out there. So I really don't know what the penalties are today and what they would become under the bills. I'd have to look at that, obviously.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I can tell you real quick. For a seatbelt, it's $25, and for a texting violation, it's $100. And both of them would make it a Class 2 misdemeanor, which is up to 6 months in jail and a fine of up to $500. They're really, really brief bills, but that's essentially what they say. Does that change your view at all on those at all?
So the penalties would be Class 2 misdemeanors?
That's correct.
yeah, I don't think that's of consequence, so I don't think that would prevent me from signing it. Again, if it reaches my desk, I have my doubts.
Governor, you made your position pretty clear on permitless carry. Senator Solano introduced a bill that kind of adds a wrinkle, I don't know if you've seen it, would blind people who have a South Dakota ID or driver's license only. I think there's a penalty, I believe, for carrying a second time. That would be very necessary. Do you have an opinion on that bill?
With regard to Senator Solano's gun bill, it is a little bit different in that it gives only residents the ability to carry without a permit, and that's the essence of the difference. I continue to believe, however, that our statute that requires a permit to carry does provide some safety for law enforcement and our citizens, and the burden of that permit process is very low. It's $10 for 5 years, and you can apply in 10 minutes. And so when you compare that burden, which is very light, against the safety that would be obtained and is obtained through the permit process, I still believe these proposals to do away with the permit are answers searching for a problem.
Governor, there were a handful of bills filed yesterday that deal with suspending refugee resettlement in South Dakota for refugees or immigrants coming from certain countries, and prohibiting cities from becoming sanctuary cities for undocumented people. Would you support those proposals?
I haven't seen those bills. I'm unaware of the degree to which a state can restrict by its own action the manner in which the federal government handles refugees. So I don't support efforts that I believe are unconstitutional, and I would have to be educated about that. That's as to the refugee and the sanctuary city added question. Again, I have not seen the bill. I do believe that if a person is detained for breaking the law or is arrested for some infraction and they're determined to be an illegal immigrant, if the federal law is that they should be handed over to immigration, then I believe we should follow that law. And I am unaware of any cities in South Dakota that are not.
There's also a...
Governor? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, ma'am.
Sorry. There's also a proposal that would bar teaching gender identity in primary and secondary schools. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know that our our standards of education are properly the subject of legislative enactments. I think the Board of Educational Standards, which is made up of experts, goes through a very thorough process, takes lots of public input, and establishes general standards that must be met. You know, when does Johnny have to know his multiplication tables? When does Susie have to read at a third grade level or read certain levels of words? Those kinds of things. And those standards are established, again, with a pretty thorough process of public hearings, public input, and then it is up to each school district to choose the curriculum that they would employ to meet those standards. I think that's a good system, and I think we should stick with that system. Yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah, at the meeting at Newspaper Day last week, you mentioned one of the things that you realized kind of late in your service, that South Dakota rivers weren't necessarily in very good shape. I'm wondering, are there particular rivers that you You didn't get specific. Were there particular rivers you were referring to? And also, was there something that came about that that led you to feel that way? New report or something?
No, well, in answer to the second, no. I would say I've just become generally aware of it from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and through media reports. I can personally observe a fairly heavy silt load that's carried by almost all of our rivers. You'll see the Missouri River, because it's restrained by the system of dams, which allow that silt to settle, is relatively clear as it exits those dams. And so the Missouri River, of course, is much cleaner until you get down to the lower reaches of it in South Dakota. Then it's much more silt laden. And I had at one time believed that the silt was a consequence of cultivation, but if you look at some of the rivers, like the White River, you'll see a heavy load of silt, and that's why it's white clay that it's carrying. I'm also aware that the Sioux River, once you get into the Sioux Falls area and downstream, it's carrying not only silt but other dissolved solids. Again, that's just what I've been told and read. And I've canoed some of the rivers. I've canoed the Sioux River a number of times. I've canoed the Missouri many times. And so just personal observation of it. I must also say that I canoed the Sioux River after a flood event in Sioux Falls a couple of years ago, and the amount of trash in the river that's carried through our storm sewers out of Sioux Falls is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, after a flood event.
Thank you.
Yep.
Would you support raising the smoking age to 21?
I consider it. I think if I remember back in my day as a legislature, I may have even sponsored such a measure. I can't remember if it's 21 or 19, but I consider that.
Governor, I don't know if you've noticed, but some of the candidates for governor have started sharing how they would come down on a few bills this year. Do you have any thoughts about their speaking to whether or not they'd sign them, and does it affect the way that you make your decision?
I was unaware of that. It would not affect my decision on it, although I think we have very good candidates for governor, and certainly value and respect every one of them. But no, it wouldn't affect what I do, and I think to the extent that they can make the public know their attitude about various issues, that's good. So have at it.
Governor Daugaard, Ken Tillerson, Military Order of the Purple Heart.
Yes.
Senate Bill 91 and Senate Bill 118 say you're supporting of it, but we had opposition from the administration at the committee hearing Wednesday afternoon, sir.
Well, I guess if that's a question, Ken, I'll say I certainly would be pleased to have a state veterans cemetery in eastern South Dakota. At the same time, there are many things I'd be pleased to see happen and done in South Dakota. We have to consider how much money we have and whether we can afford them. And so I think one of the things that is important to understand, what are the realistic costs of operating such a cemetery? And I think, as I understood it from persons who were present at that hearing, the expression was that we should not move forward with a decision until we have a better understanding of what those costs are. And I think that's only responsible government.
Yes, I agree with you, Governor. the National Cemetery Administration put forth projected costs and revenues. Based on that, 2 employees were looking at about a $79,000 profit per year.
Well, it's my understanding that every state cemetery that we have spoken to have said that they do not a single one of them, operate at a profit. And in fact, every single one of them requires a state appropriation. So we can use what people think might be the case or what we see is actually the case in other similar cemeteries. And again, I think that's the most responsible approach.
Well, I agree. The Senate Bill 118 is to set up for an endowment to pay for that so the citizens of the state of South Dakota wouldn't be having to pay to maintain it.
I think that's a very responsible approach.
I'm going to bring questions back to the room. Zach, it looked like you had a question earlier.
Yeah, I've got two, if that's all right. The first one, Governor, is House Bill 1206 would repeal the half-cent tourism tax. Your thoughts on doing that when things are tight? Do additional taxes need to be taken back?
I think that bill has no future. I think once the first hearing comes along, you'll see the significant opposition that will be raised by the tourism industry, and I think that bill won't go anywhere.
The second one, real quick, we're about halfway through the session. Your thoughts on what you've seen and maybe your thoughts on what you would anticipate moving forward?
Well, again, the session is a busy one, more bill load. I'm seeing a number of bills replicated in both houses, so that might be creating the impression that there are more issues in play when in fact they're just getting 2 bites at the apple for the same issue. That might be occurring. I continue to be focused on the budget. A week from Monday, I think the Joint Appropriations Committee will be hearing from the Bureau of Finance and Management and also from the Legislative Research Council economists their projection of revenue for fiscal year 19. By that time, we will also have an additional month of history. We should get that month of history next week. That would be the December sales that are paid in at the end of January and now are being assembled in these first couple of days of February. And so we'll get the report for December sales. And with that additional history, also another thing that has occurred since my budget address in December is Congress has enacted a comprehensive and significant tax bill. And the Council of Economic Advisors and the economic firm that provides guidance to our council, that would be Markit, M-A-R-K-I-T, IHS Markit, which is a very large econometrics firm that many states use and even many countries use, market research. Their economic projections were created with the assumption that no tax bill would pass. So the budget projections and revenue projections utilized those figures, and now I know they will be adjusted at the national level, and that'll affect the state level. So depending upon what this additional month of history shows and how the econometrics numbers have been adjusted as a consequence of the tax bill, I'm hopeful that our revenue picture will improve a little bit and we'll have a little more breathing room and perhaps be able to offer something to schools and Medicaid providers and state employees. But that's only a hope. That's certainly not a known quantity yet. We will know that February or whatever that date would be. Today's the 2nd, so 3rd, 4th, 5th would be the Tuesday following, a week from this Tuesday. The Joint Appropriations Committee, I think, will make their adopted revenue decision. So that's certainly on my mind yet as this session unfolds. And we're not even quite halfway there yet, so there's still a lot to go.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I was going to ask kind of,
Hey, Governor? Oh,
Oh, James?
go ahead, sir.
just following up on Dan's question about some of the initiative, the referendum changes.
Yes.
If you had given any thought specifically to petition circulation, some of the bills that they're talking about, adding the geographic requirement for a signature banner, or banning the paid circulation, some of those things. Do you have any thoughts on that?
The question was, do I have any thoughts on banning paid circulators or requiring geographic limitations on circulation? I had not seen those bills at all. Those must be relatively recent SJRs or HJRs, and I have not read them. Again, you want to balance the rights of the citizens to get things on the ballot and not restrict them unduly. I think more concern is the complexity of the measure, the light or the relatively easy means of getting something on the ballot as a constitutional amendment, and the worrisome situation where out-of-state interests are making their will known in South Dakota and utilizing our process that was meant for citizens of our state to raise things that concern them rather than outsiders raising things that concern them. Other questions?
Yeah, Governor, I just wanted to go back, this is Art again. I sort of asked you both about the seatbelt and texting laws and their separate measures. I just wanted to be sure I had that right. It sounded like if either one of those came to your desk, you would consider signing them, but do you have a different feeling on seatbelts as opposed to texting?
Well, I'd want to consider both of them. I think they both are behaviors that can be distracting or, well, they're different, I guess. They are different. Texting is a distracted driving problem. Seatbelts is more of a safety issue that the consequences are more felt by the person who fails to buckle up, whereas the texting decision can be felt by those who are injured because the texting driver is distracted. So they're a little bit different, but I haven't seen those bills. I'd be open to looking at them, but again, they haven't made their way through the legislature, and I think in the past these have been difficult to get the legislature to accept or to consider.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask, Representative Jameson has a bill that would require the ballot committee accepted an out-of-state contribution. They would have to put a disclaimer on that advertisement saying paid for in part by out-of-state money. Is that something you would consider?
Yes, I would. The question was, if you couldn't hear it, and I have not seen that bill. It would be, I presume, a law that would restrict the advertising supported by out-of-state money as forcing a disclosure that it was out-of-state money that was paying for the ad. Yeah, I think that would be suitable. Yep.
Governor, do you think there's any chance, I know your budget right now proposes a zero increase for K through 12. Do you see any options, or is there anything you know of that might lead to an actual increase in funding for education?
I really don't know. It depends on whether we see growth in this last month, and more importantly, whether the economic projections are considerably better because of the tax law change. And again, I'm not an economist, so I do know the Bureau of Finance and Management has a pretty good econometric model that utilizes history, utilizes these leading indicators, and it's hard to get $1.6 billion worth of revenue projected when you're looking that far into the future, but the model is pretty good, within 1% or 2%, but that 1 or 2% margin, you have to be careful because those are millions and millions of dollars. So if you miss it by even a little bit, you're 10 million in the red or 20 million in the red, and we don't want that. So my philosophy has always been, you can always spend the money if you didn't anticipate it and it arrives. But if you anticipate and embed in your spending a revenue stream that doesn't show up, now you're cutting people, now you're in trouble. Now you may have already started spending at that level, and now you have to not only reduce down to where the ongoing stream is, but you have to offset the overspending that's already occurred. So that was a problem this year in the fiscal year 18 because revenue is coming in at a lower level than we'd projected. And also some of our expenditures are higher. We had more kids in the K-12 system than we projected, so the per pupil payment goes up because you've got more pupils. And I might remind everyone that we do see, even in the modest revenue projections that were offered in the December budget, we saw growth of about $30 million for fiscal year 19 over 18. And where does that 30 million go? Well, 20 of it goes to education. Most of that, 16 million, goes to education, K-12 education. Again, we project more students. So if you're a school district that has 600 students and now you have next year 606, you're going to get more money. Will you have to hire more teachers? Will you have to pay for more heat in the building? A lot of your variable costs will not change. A lot of your fixed costs will not change. And so will you have more money? Yes, you'll have more money to spend. Now, some of those might be right at the margin where you add 6 more kids, and if they're in 1 grade, you've got to add a teacher. Now, you're probably going to go backwards if you're that school district. You're going to have more expense than you will have additional revenue. So it's a school by school, but that's why we have school boards and superintendents and business managers who adapt to those variables and make it work. And I have confidence in our school boards and school districts. They can make these things work.
Governor, I have to ask some hard news here.
Yes.
Patriots, more. Who's your pick in the Super Bowl?
Well,
What does the First Lady think, and does she agree?
I have not asked the First Lady. We agreed yesterday we were going to watch the Super Bowl. She asked me, "Are you going to watch the Super Bowl?" I said, "Well, yes, I'm going to watch it." And I had hopes for the Vikings. They were just overwhelmed by the Eagles, so I'm going to root for the Eagles. And I don't know who the First Lady's rooting for. All right, well, thank you, everyone.
You